elevated position with his father, and they kind of hated him. They hated that coat specifically, probably because it was a reminder to them of the fact that Joseph was the favorite. And if you'll recall, Joseph had two dreams. The brothers were, the 12 brothers were binding sheaves in the field. And then you'll remember the 11 sheaves bowed down to Joseph's sheaf. And the second dream was the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to Joseph. And this dream, when it was told to Jacob, actually upset Jacob as well a little bit. And if you'll remember that. And then you'll also remember just a little bit after that point, Joseph was sent to check on his brothers in Shechem. And you'll recall they were living in the valley of Hebron. And so from Hebron to Shechem was about 50 miles. And that was quite a bit of a walk. And if he took an animal, it would have been, of course, a little shorter, but still quite a distance. And then Joseph finally got to Shechem, and he realized, and he finds out from those people in the land that his brothers had actually traveled on to Dothan. And what I didn't mention last week is that Dothan was about 15 miles further away from home, or further north, than even Shechem was. So he had traveled about 65 miles to go find his brothers, and that's crazy. I mean, that's a long way of traveling, but yet he decided, no, I'm going to do what Dad told me to do. Now, he could have turned around at Shechem and he could have said, Dad, the boys weren't there. The brothers weren't there. He could have tattled, but he said, no, my dad sent me on a job. I'm going to go do that job. And so he finally did it. And of course, as he's coming up, as he's approaching Dothan, his brothers hatched this plot against him. Originally, they had planned to kill him. And they said, man, we just hate this guy. We're going to kill him. And we're going to throw him in a pit. But then they were convinced otherwise. Reuben convinced them otherwise to throw him in a pit and just leave him there. And of course, as the story goes, they saw the Ishmaelites coming down and coming along the road, and they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And somebody asked this last week, so I went ahead and looked it up. 20 pieces of silver is approximately $200 today. So they still, I mean, that's not a lot of money to sell somebody for. That's not very much money, and that's what they sold Joseph for. And I mean, maybe we're thinking it's a lot of money, but it's really not that much money when you think about a whole person. You sold him for a whole person for 20. Anyway, so that was an interesting little tidbit of information I found out. And then, of course, the Ishmaelites traveled with their newly purchased slave down to Egypt. And then that's where we left the story at the end of chapter 37 of Genesis. Chapter 38 goes into a little, I almost call it an anecdote about Judah, which we will not cover at this time. So we can skip to 39, Genesis 39, and we pick the story of Joseph back up from where Genesis 37 left off. So first, I want us to look at Joseph with Potiphar's work. Joseph is taken very, very far from home. He had, as I already said, he traveled about 65 miles to find his brothers, but now he found himself around 215 miles from home. I mean, back in this day, I mean, this was before the days, and we'll get to this in just a second, but this was the day before the days of cars, before the days of any kind of cellular technology, and so he had very little communication with his family. If he didn't have any communication with his family, essentially getting taken 215 miles away was like, okay, you're never going to see your family again. Essentially, that's what was going on here. And to put in perspective the distance, Providence, Rhode Island is around 210 miles from here. So if you want to know exactly how far he was traveling, it was from here to Providence. Now, could you imagine walking from here to Providence? Could you imagine riding a camel or a donkey from here to Providence? Yeah, so it was basically a death sentence, but he was basically never going to see his family again, and that's where he was being taken. Now, being taken 215 miles from home to us wouldn't seem like a big deal, okay? Yeah, I can, if I really need to, I can call an Uber, right? Again, I don't know if Uber drives 200 miles or not, but I can take a couple of taxis, take a bus, take a train, whatever the case. I can get home if I'm 200 miles away, and it wouldn't be super expensive. But here, I mean, it's a big deal. He might as well have been moving from here to China in this day, because there was no communication, there was no transportation, there was nothing. And so Joseph basically was walking down to Egypt, and he was thinking, I'm never going to see my family again. He didn't know what was in store. He had no idea what was coming down the line. All he knew was, I'm going to Egypt, and I'm never going to see my family again. Now, if you recall, we talked last week that Joseph was only about 17 years old at this time, and so he's just a boy, or what we would call a boy, but he's just a young man, and to be taken from his family is kind of a big deal, but he was brought down to Egypt. So Joseph arrives in Egypt with the Ishmaelites, and then finds himself being sold to an Egyptian man that was a high-ranking officer of Pharaoh. You see that in verse number 1. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. So he had been traveling all this time with the Ishmaelites. It was probably quite a journey. He probably got to know the Ishmaelites a little bit. I don't know his circumstance. I don't know if he was tied up. I don't know if he was gagged. I don't know what happened there. All you know is he was brought down, and so he probably got to know the mannerisms of the Ishmaelites a little bit. But now he finds himself being transferred, if you will, to this next guy, who was an Egyptian man, and we see that this man was the captain of Pharaoh's guard. You see it right there in verse 1, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard. Now I didn't have to look it up, because you know what captain of the guard means, but you know what exactly is that? Well, Pharaoh had a kind of a bodyguard. They had some security in the capital, and this guy was the captain. So he's like the head over all of the guards there, and so that's what his position was, and his name was Potiphar. You can find it right there in the Bible, but it's spelled Potiphar. And Potiphar is his owner, if you will, his master. And even though Joseph is in a very different land, and a land that's very different from his own, not only geographically, it's quite a ways away, but also culturally, if you think about it. If you think about Egyptian culture in comparison to Jewish culture, now Jewish culture hadn't been established at this point, but you could kind of see the differences already. How many of us know anything about Egypt? Anything at all? I mean, at least you know where it is on the map. Anything. So you know at least a little bit about Egypt, and they had the pyramids, they had the gods, the Ra, they had all the Sphinx, Great Sphinx, they had all that. So the culture was at least a little bit different from Joseph's hometown, and yet he remains faithful to the Lord, and the Lord remains faithful to him. And we'll see that. We'll look in verses 2 and 3. The Bible says, and the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. So even though God brought Joseph down to Egypt, God didn't bring Joseph down to Egypt and then just leave him there. He didn't just say, oh, well, you're gone to Egypt now, so I'm done with you. You just stay there forever. No, God was still with Joseph, and Joseph remained faithful to the Lord, and the Lord remained faithful to Joseph. And we see that it doesn't take very long for Potiphar to notice that God is with Joseph, and so he's living there, and he's just doing his work, and he sees, man, the master, or Potiphar, says, man, he's got everything going. I mean, everything that he touches, he's prospering. And so Potiphar, being a wise steward, and he says, man, this one servant's doing so good, he's prospering all the time, his God is with him, I'm going to promote him. And so we see very quickly in verses 4 and 5 that Joseph is made overseer over all of the house of Potiphar. Verse 4, and Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. So we see very clearly that Joseph remained faithful to the Lord. He continued to stay faithful to God. and God continued to stay faithful to him. And we see that as he's growing, as he's staying faithful, God is blessing. And as God is blessing not only Joseph, but he's blessing those around him as well, and blessing the house of this master that he is under. Now it doesn't. Let's see where we are. Where are we in the notes? This put Joseph in prime position when he became overseer of Potiphar's house. It put Joseph in a prime position to learn of Egyptian customs and how to deal with the Egyptian people in a public sense. And that's something that I had never really thought about until I was studying for this. And but it really put him in a prime position now he's an overseer of the house, so he's dealing with the Egyptians in every sense. He's dealing with them in business, he's dealing with them in commerce and in the economy. He's dealing with them in every single way, and it's really giving him the insight into how the Egyptian culture works, and which will come into a lot of play later in the story, which we will not cover this week, but we'll hopefully cover next week. And so he's gaining all of this knowledge by being the overseer of this man's house in a land that he had never had any intention of going to. He didn't know this is where he was going to end up, but he was put into this place, and he decided, I'm going to learn everything I can from where I'm at. And so he's taking in all this information, and he's learning of it. And so this also gave Joseph the opportunity to learn about public business in Egyptian culture. Now, Potiphar, he grows to trust Joseph so much that actually Potiphar stops keeping tabs on everything that he has. See that in verse 6. The Bible says, and he left, talking about Potiphar, and he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had. Could you imagine being so wealthy and being so prosperous that you don't even have to keep tabs on how much you have?
That must be nice.
Could you imagine? He said, man, this guy's got it. I don't even have to worry about it. Could you imagine? And yet, that's what this guy did. He just said, I trust Joseph completely. I don't care what happens. He's going to take care of it. And that's how prosperous Joseph made this guy. And I can't imagine being that prosperous. And yet, it shows not only that Joseph was causing him to prosper, but also it shows the relationship between Joseph and Potiphar. It was a relationship built on trust. It was a relationship where Potiphar said, this is my overseer, he's over my entire house, and I don't feel like I need to be hovering or micromanaging or saying, man, how much is this? How's this going? I don't need to really manage it because he's going to take care of it. And which also is a testament to Joseph, if you really think about it, because Joseph did everything he could to learn what his master wanted. To say, okay, this is what the master's going to want, this is how he's going to want it done. And so the master didn't even have to check on anything that was going on, which I'm getting a little off topic, but that is an amazing testimony to Joseph in itself right there. So Potiphar grows to trust Joseph so much that Potiphar stops keeping tabs, and this shows that Joseph is not only faithful to the Lord, but he's also faithful to those that had the charge over him. I mean, Joseph got to this position, and he knew that Potiphar didn't keep tabs anymore, and he knew that he was trusted. He could have very easily done a whole bunch of stuff to undermine Potiphar. He could have very easily taken the wrong path, but he decided, no, I'm going to stay faithful. I'm going to be diligent. I'm going to be do everything that I can to make sure that I am loyal and faithful to Potiphar, even though he owns me. Essentially, is what he does. And so that is what Joseph does. He's faithful not only to the Lord, but to those that have charge over him as well. Now, regardless of Joseph's personal feelings about Potiphar, his wife, or their lifestyle, Joseph remained loyal to Potiphar. Now, why do I say that? Well, think about it. Joseph came from one background that was entirely different from the background he's now living in. And so, I mean, just think about the cultural difference. I mean, the culture he came from, his brothers were shepherds. His dad was a shepherd. His upbringing was shepherding or keeping sheep, and now he's in a place where he is his master or his owner is now keeping one people, but two, they're security force for an army, an empire at this point. And so there's a massive difference culturally. There's a massive difference in his upbringing from what he was upbrought to now. And yet, so I can imagine that probably Joseph's personal feelings were, I don't know if I like this. I don't know, this isn't the way I would have done it. This isn't the way I was raised. And yet he decided that he was going to be loyal to Potiphar regardless. Now we'll get some more insight into that in just a second. But next we're going to talk about Joseph with Potiphar's wife. Now, during all of this time, this time, the Bible doesn't say how long, how many years accumulated here, but you can imagine it was probably at least a few. And during all of this time, Potiphar's wife was actually filled with lust toward Joseph. We see that in verse 7. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." So she has a lustful attitude toward Joseph. Now, there's no real reason, we're not given a reason why he caught her attention. But if you were to just logic it out, it could be that Joseph showed a level of responsibility that caught her eye. It could be that Joseph, maybe he was different. As we talked about, his culture, his upbringing was different from everything that she was used to. Maybe that caught her eye. It could have been that she knew Joseph was faithful to God and she wanted him to fall. She wanted him to stop being faithful to God. It could have been that. Well, the Bible doesn't make it clear, but there are several different conclusions we can come to as we look ahead. Now, Potiphar's wife, when I was a kid, somebody called her Mrs. Potty, Mrs. Potiphar. Yeah. But anyway, we're not gonna call her Mrs. We're just called Potiphar's wife. She tries to get Joseph to sin with her. You see that in verse 7. She said, "Lie with me." Now, that would be, she's saying, commit the act of adultery with me. And she's saying, I know I'm married, and I know you're a slave, but let's do this. And she's trying to manipulate him into causing a kind of a huge issue. And so she's propositioning to Joseph that they commit the act of adultery together. Now, Joseph wisely rejects her advance and explains why exactly he cannot. Look in verse 8. The Bible says, "But he refused and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against," notice the next word, "God." He's not talking about sinning against Potiphar. He's talking about sinning against God, which we'll get to in just a second. But here's a few of the reasons that Joseph states in here. And he says, "Look, I cannot do that with you. I cannot do that because," and here are the reasons why. One, Potiphar trusts Joseph completely. So much so that he doesn't even have to keep track of anything anymore. He said, "Joseph, you've got it all. I trust you completely. I trust you totally." Now, I couldn't imagine trusting somebody else with all of my finances that much. Couldn't personally do it. Yet Potiphar finds so much faith in Joseph that he can say, "I trust you that much." And Joseph is saying, how could I possibly go against that? How could I possibly go against the trust that has been put in me? Potiphar not only cares for me, but he trusts me to take care of his things. How could I go behind his back and not be faithful to him, not be loyal to him? How could I go and break his trust? Number two, Joseph has the power and control over everything in Potiphar's house except his wife. Wouldn't it seem a little bit ungrateful if Joseph were to say, I have everything and I can do anything I want in this entire house, but that's not enough for me. I also want your wife. Wouldn't that seem a little bit ungrateful? That'd seem a little bit ungrateful, wouldn't it? And so Joseph would seem ungrateful for the favor that he's been granted. And then at the very base of his reasoning, and this is the big point, and the other two you could probably argue on, but this is the biggest point, was that he could not commit this act of wickedness because it would be a sin against, not Potiphar, not against himself, but against God. It would be a sin against God. This shows you a lot into Joseph's character. it shows you a lot into Joseph's mindset. He's saying, I cannot sin, though it may have been a temptation. Now, when I was younger, I was telling my wife earlier, I said, I told her when I was a kid, I always thought that Potiphar was like this old hag, and she was just ugly. But I don't think that's the case. And she was probably one of the most beautiful women in Egypt at that time. And so for this temptation to be brought to him, I guarantee it probably wasn't a easy thing to say no to, but it was definitely something that he needed to say no to. It would serve us all well to take into account the consequences of our actions before we commit any sinful act. Now, a lot of times I think a lot of us will sin and they'll say, oh man, now I got to pay the consequences for that. Wouldn't it be better for us to have thought of the consequences before we committed the sin? Wouldn't it have been better to say, I could go do this, but oh, wait a second. If I do that, then I'm going to get this. This is the price that's going to be paid. Yeah, I probably shouldn't do that. Wouldn't that be easier than coming through the other side and saying, oh, well, now I have to pay the consequences? Now, the consequences could be pretty heavy. They could be heavier than you want to bear. But it would be so much easier if we just consider the consequences before we commit the action or the sinful act. So we see that Potiphar's wife persistently pursues Joseph. And it's not just a one-time thing where she says, oh, come and lie with me. But in verse 10, you kind of see the depth of how badly she was after Joseph. The Bible says, and it came to pass as she spoke to Joseph day by day. I mean, this is a daily occurrence. She's coming after him, and she's provoking him. She's tempting him. She's hoping that one day, maybe eventually, he'll fall. That he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment, in her hand, and fled and got him out. So we see that she's relentless. She's constantly pursuing after Joseph, and she's constantly coming after him, and then finally gets to the place where she sees that she's not affecting him at all. She sees that he's just not having it. He's just not interested at all, and she decides that she's going to lay a trap. And she says, you know what, I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to make it happen so that either he's going to do it or I'm going to get him in trouble. And that is essentially what's going on here in verses 11 and 12. So we see in verse 11 that Joseph went into the house to do his business as was usual, as was regular, as he regularly did. He went into the house, he did his business. The way this reads is it doesn't read that this was a random occurrence. It reads that this was something that he did regularly, was to go into the house. And then we see that there was nobody in the house with him at that time. So there was no second witness, which is part of the reason why we go 2 by 2, by the way, is because you want somebody else there to say, okay, well, if somebody rails an accusation against you, you can say, well, I had so-and-so with me, and they can attest to the fact that nothing happened. And then you have two against one. Well, I mean, most of the time, almost should be all the time, 2 against 1 always wins, right? Two wins, not 1. And so that's why we go out. But there was no second witness here. And so she said, regardless of what happens, I have him. I've got him in a trap. I've got him trapped so he can't do anything. He's going to have to either commit the sin or I can get him in trouble. And so she catches him, and she catches him by the coat, and she says it again. She says, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. So he leaves. I mean, he's gone. So Potiphar's wife caught him by his coat and told him to sin with her. And then Joseph shed his coat and he fled. I mean, he ran. He was gone. I mean, if you've ever seen Roadrunner, Wile E. Coyote, that's what I picture in my head. They're gone, right? And so Joseph is out of there. Then, of course, Potiphar's wife uses Joseph's coat to accuse him of attacking her. Now, Potiphar's wife decided that since she could not have Joseph, she wouldn't let anybody else have him either. because she starts to accuse him. Now, to give you a little bit of a frame of reference, the penalty for adultery or trying to commit adultery is death. And so, Joseph could be put to death for this. And so she maybe thinks that, yeah, my husband's going to come home. And I'm going to tell him this story. I'm going to make up this lie. And he's going to believe me because I'm his wife. Why wouldn't he believe me? And I'm going to make up this lie. And I'm going to get Joseph killed. So I can't have him. So nobody can have him. And so Potiphar's wife calls out for the men of the house. And she rails her accusation against Joseph to the men. And then you see that she will hold closely the only thing that she could use to show proof of her story. It was his coat. Now we'll read that in verse 16. The Bible says, and she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. I don't know why I picture her in this chair and she's just got his jacket and she's just like petting it. I don't know why. She's just sitting there petting the jacket. Oh yeah, I got you now. You're in trouble. And that's what I'm picturing, and that's what essentially she's doing, because when the Lord comes home, when the master comes home, she speaks to him according verse 17, and she spake unto him according to these words, saying, the Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, to see the lies that she's trying to spread here. And it came to pass as I lifted up my voice and cried that he left his garment with me and fled out. Now there's a couple of observations we can make here. One is that this is the second time in Joseph's life that his coat has been used to propagate a lie. The first time was with his brothers. His brothers took his coat, if you'll recall from last week. His brothers took his coat and they covered it in blood, the blood of an animal, and brought it to Jacob. And Jacob said, "Oh man, a wild animal must have killed him." Well, that was a lie. That was not true at all. And now, of course, this time, where Potiphar's wife tells her husband that Joseph had ill intentions toward her, and but of course, that's not how it happened. Now, the other observation we can make is that her story doesn't really seem to make sense. You know, if Joseph attacked her, why does she have his coat? I think about that for just a second. I mean, why? That doesn't make any sense. Her claim is that he just left it behind as she was crying out. Notice what the verse says. And it came to pass as I lifted up my voice and cried that he left his garment with me. It's like she's crying. Okay, let me take off my jacket and leave it behind. That doesn't really make any sense, right? And so her story doesn't really add up. And her having his coat does not indicate that he did the advancing, but quite the opposite. I mean, it indicates quite the opposite, that she grabbed onto him and grabbed him by the coat, and he's trying to flee and run away, and he just shed, like I would shed off my jacket, right? Of course, faster than I did. But yeah, if somebody over here has my jacket, it's not indicating that I attacked him, right? That doesn't even make sense. But it indicates the other way, in that, well, I was the attacker. I was the just petting the coat. I'm trying to get back on here. Back to the story. So of course she tells this story to Potiphar, and then we see Potiphar's wrath. Verse 19, and it came to pass when his master heard the words of his wife, which he spake unto him, saying, after this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. Now, it seems pretty clear that Potiphar's wrath was kindled toward Joseph. Yet, as I stated before, the penalty for committing adultery very easily could have been death. And Potiphar throws Joseph into the king's prison instead of killing him. Now, you'd think that if the wrath was kindled against Joseph, he would just kill him. I mean, that's the penalty for adultery. If his wrath was kindled, he would have killed him, and that would have been it. And so, to give the clarity to this point, the punishment for adultery in Egyptian law was death. Potiphar could very easily have had Joseph put to death for this crime, and no one would have even questioned it. Nobody. I mean, one, he was a slave. Two, he had this accusation railed against him. Nobody would have even questioned. But Potiphar decided to put him in prison, and so Potiphar throws Joseph into prison instead, probably because Potiphar didn't totally believe his wife's story. You could do some thinking on that on your own if you choose to, but probably the case is that he didn't quite fully, totally believe his wife's story, and so he didn't want to kill Joseph. And perhaps, if you look at it even further, perhaps Potiphar's wrath was actually kindled toward his wife for making him lose his best servant. Because think of the situation that Potiphar's in now. Now he's put in the position of showing his rule over his servants or letting his servants do as they pleased. If Joseph got a free pass on this accusation, it would have indicated to the rest of the servants that he was lenient on crimes committed. And so the rest of his servants could have said, well, I can go do this, I can steal food, I can do that, I can do this. Because Potiphar's not that big. He's a big pushover. He's a big teddy bear. I'm not gonna have to worry about it. This would essentially have pushed Potiphar into a corner. So he could either lose his best servant, or he could lose control of all of his servants. Period. I think about it. Think of the situation. Think of what's happening here. And of course, to disclaimer, there's no biblical backing for this. That's just kind of my thought process behind it. So don't take it as gospel, because it's not gospel. It's not even the Bible. Just a thought process. The only thing that I could even say to that is Potiphar's wrath was kindled. Now it doesn't say who it was kindled toward. It just says that it was kindled. And so anyway, so leave that here nor there. You can take it. You can leave it. You can do whatever you want with it. It's not Bible, so don't preach it like Bible. So Joseph could have also protested the accusation, but he chose not to. Think about that. He could have said, well, Potiphar, I know your wife told me this, but I told you this, but this is what actually happened. He could have easily said, you know what, that's not what actually happened, but Joseph was loyal to his master to the end, to the point where his servitude ended and he became essentially terminated. That it could have been very easily, he could have easily turned his back, but he decided not to. He decided to remain loyal. At this point, Joseph undoubtedly knew the blow that it would deal to Potiphar's house if the truth came out about the situation. Could you imagine being in a kind of a position of power in these days, and to have it go public that your wife committed adultery with a servant? I mean, that would destroy the house. And I'm sure that Joseph probably saw that and was not spiteful or vengeful toward Potiphar, but remained loyal and didn't rail his own accusations back. What a powerful testimony Joseph was able to have by saying, you know what, you've been good to me, you've been loyal to me, and even though this situation happened, I'm going to stay loyal to you till the end. Now, of course, we see Joseph was thrown into the king's prison, and we see very much a roller coaster happen here. And that's verses 19 to 23. We don't have time to read it now. But he's thrown into the king's prison. And we definitely have seen a roller coaster effect in Joseph's life. First, he's beloved by his father. Then he's sold into slavery by his brothers. Then he's put in a position of power, second in command to Potiphar. And then he's thrown into the king's prison. I mean, he's a roller coaster of a life here. And next week, we're going to finish up the life of Joseph. And we'll see just how God brings everything together, and God always brings everything together. And but God uses everything that's happened so far for a very specific reason, and we'll see that next week. But here are a few things we can take away from the lesson, and I'll be quick here. We would do well to learn about loyalty to one another. Just because somebody makes a mistake, or maybe even commits a sin that we know they shouldn't commit, and they know that they shouldn't commit, doesn't mean we should cast them aside. Just because somebody makes a mistake, just because somebody messes up, doesn't mean we should just throw them away forever. And that's not what the Bible teaches, one. And then two, that doesn't show loyalty in any way, shape, or form. Our friends ought to know that we love them and appreciate them, even though we know that they have flaws. Now, we live in an era where mistakes suddenly, they define who somebody is. It's like the rest of your life, you've got this thing hanging over your head. You are so-and-so. You've done this. And it's becoming more and more like that. And but that's not what the Bible says, that we should be loyal to one another. Now, I understand that we shouldn't condone sin. There's a difference between condoning sin and loving the sinner. We've talked about that over and over again. But we should be loyal to our friends. Christians ought to live in such a way that means that we are loyal to somebody even if they're not loyal to us. And even if somebody's not loyal to us, doesn't mean that we should not be loyal to them. You know, if somebody goes behind my back and they talk bad about me all the time, and I don't know what you guys talk. If you guys got together at home or at the house and watched season 4 of The Chosen and talked to a man, just decided to rail on pastor, man, I can't stand that guy. He does this and that. Just because you're not loyal to me doesn't mean that I shouldn't be loyal to you. And so just because somebody else, and so I might know somebody else is talking bad about me, but I don't think you guys do that, just so you know. I hope you don't do that, but I don't think you guys do that. But just because, even if I know somebody else isn't being loyal to me, doesn't mean that I should be loyal to them. Not so, oh man, I can't believe they did that, I'm done. I can never be friends with them again. That's not loyalty. That's the opposite of loyalty. That's okay, I know you messed up. It's okay. I understand. Because last time I checked, not everybody's perfect. I mean, nobody's perfect, right? And so I'll mess up too. I'm sorry. I try to do the best I can, but everybody's going to mess up sometimes. And that just because we mess up doesn't mean that we shouldn't be loyal to somebody. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to be loyal? To be loyal is to love a friend, even if they are flawed and a sinner. Yeah, that's to love somebody regardless of what their situation is, what their problem is, what the issue is that they have. Be loyal to your friends. Chances are they probably know what they're doing is wrong, and they probably expect you to hate them for it. How many of us, when we do something wrong, we look around and we're like, man, somebody's gonna see that, somebody's gonna hate me, right? I mean, man, make sure nobody's watching, right? Make sure nobody's watching. I don't want anybody to watch. Let's be loyal. That's one thing we can learn. Another thing we can learn is that temptations to sin are never going to go away. We're going to face them forever. Joseph did. Joseph faced it day by day. Now, how we deal with that temptation is what is important. Notice the 3 different things that Joseph did here, and we'll go back, and we don't have time to really flesh them out too much. But one, he stated clearly all the reasons why he could not commit that sin while refusing to give into it. He said, no, I can't do it because of this, and I can't do it because of this, and I can't do it because of this. And then he also said, I'm not going to do it. And these are the reasons why. He probably reminded himself and the person who was tempting him the reasons why he couldn't do it. Next, he stayed as far away from that temptation as he could. Look back at verse 10. And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her. Notice the next 5 words there. Or to be with her. So he wasn't even close to her. He stayed away from her as far, 10-foot pole, 100-foot pole. He was stayed away from her as far as he possibly could. But we need to steer clear of our temptations. We ought to do the same. Do you have a problem with drinking? Stay away from stores that sell alcohol. Stay away from the liquor section of Walmart or Hannaford or wherever. Stay away from that area if you have a problem with that temptation. Have a problem with smoking? Don't go into cigarette shops. Stay out of gas stations. Gas stations got them everywhere. Decide to make it a point to avoid going into the gas station whenever possible. We have the glories of the 21st century. You can go get gas somewhere. And this might be a newsflash to everybody, but you can go get gas somewhere and never leave the pump. Did you know that?
Oh,
21st century. You never have to leave the pump. You just swipe the card, and you can. If that's what you have to do to keep yourself from buying cigarettes or smoking, do it. Because I would rather you stay as far away from them as possible than to have the problem of continuing to do that. You have a problem with looking at explicit content? Maybe get rid of or lock down any device that is a temptation to you. Hey, Pastor, what? How dare you suggest something like that? I'd rather you get rid of it or not be able to access everything you think you should be able to access than to have that going on in your life. I'd rather you stay away from that temptation than to be committing that sin. That give you a personal story. Back when my wife and I were dating, I asked her to lock down my phone so that she never had to question if I was going to be looking at things that I shouldn't be looking at. And so to this day, you can get on my phone. I have no access to Safari, Google, nothing. I have no access to any of that. I don't have YouTube. I got nothing. And it's because I want my wife to trust me. Now, it's not a temptation, but I want her to trust me. I want her to know that I'm not looking at things that I ought not be looking at. You think, wow, That's difficult. That's a difficult one. Well, I'd rather you, the one that Dallas always brings up, better to enter into heaven maimed and halted.
Yeah, favorite.
So get rid of it. Get rid of it. Or lock it down. Whatever the problem is, get rid of it. Do you have a problem with drugs? Avoid the areas of town that would make it easy for you to obtain drugs. Maybe block the number of your dealer and delete the contact. I don't know much about drugs. Maybe that's old-fashioned. I have no idea. But get rid of it. Yeah, stay away from it. Have a problem with stealing? Decide everywhere you go, whenever you step into a store, that you're going to put your hands in your pocket at all times, and you're gonna keep your hands in your pocket unless you're picking it up to buy it. And it's awful hard to steal something when my hands are in my pockets, right? My hands are in here. I ain't stealing nothing. I'm staying away from stealing. I'm staying away from the temptation of stealing because my hands are in my pocket. Have a problem with pride? Decide that you're only going to talk about others to others instead of talking about yourself. A lot of times we get into these conversations and we say, well, I did this and I did that and I had this, I did this and I'm so great and I did this and I did that. And we seldom ever talk about other people and what's going on in their life. And I will often have to remind myself, if I'm talking to somebody new, they don't want to talk about me. They want to talk about them. So I'm going to talk about them. I'm going to say, hey, how are you doing? How was your day? What are you doing today? Because I don't want them to think it's about me. And if I keep talking about me, the more I talk about me, the more lifted up with pride I get. And so if I'm going to avoid having pride, I'm going to decide that I'm going to talk about others to others, not to talk about others behind their back, but talk about others to others as opposed to talking about myself. I wish we could go through every problem in life. Wish we could go through life without dealing with any temptations, but we cannot. Let's determine that we're going to stay as far away from temptation as we possibly can. And last one, I'll just give you this for the note's sake. Remember that God has a plan for everything. Even if you're not in the best of places right now, God has a reason for placing you there. Now, Joseph didn't want to be in Egypt. He wanted to be with his family, I'm sure. He wanted to be with his dad. God had a reason for putting him in Egypt. Joseph decided to make the best with what he was given. He used the opportunity while he was in Egypt to develop some skills that he maybe never had thought he would have needed, but God placed him in that position to do exactly that. There's always something you can be learning no matter where you are in life. I don't care if you have $1 million or if you have 3 cents in your bank account. You can always be learning something. And you never know how God is going to use that very skill in the future. In conclusion, Joseph is a Bible character that we can learn so much from. I feel like we've still only barely scratched the surface, and we've taken 2 weeks on him. And we'll take 3 in total. He certainly had his ups and downs in life, and he decided that he was going to always learn to make the best in every situation. What a display of wisdom we see in the story of Joseph. Let's determine to allow God to do what he deems best in our lives, and we're just going to continue to make the best with what we have. I put, because I couldn't stop thinking about it as I was at the bottom there, I put, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. I couldn't stop thinking about that while I was writing this. But that's essentially what Joseph kept doing. Life gave him lemons, so he just kept making lemonade. That's just what he kept doing. But anyway, I know it went a little long, so let's pray, and we'll close down for the evening. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Thank you for the opportunity to preach this lesson. I pray that you would help